It's no secret that collecting physical games for older consoles is expensive, and a lot of people have looked to import games from other regions to keep the cost low and the wallet happy. But what if I told you it isn't always that easy? That you might wait in anticipation for a new delivery, only to be met with an unplayable game? Let me share the trouble I got myself into recently with some imported games, and explain the risks here that might keep you from being a happy gamer. So I'm based in the US, and I had a very small library of games when I grew up with my Sega Saturn, which drove me to pick up a used one a few years ago and work to get hold of some of those classics. I always lean towards physical games if it's available, and if you don't need a second mortgage to buy a copy, looking at you Panzer Dragoon Saga. But a lot of these prices are beyond what I would consider, and that motivated me to look to other regions. Now, the Sega Saturn was released in the mid-90s in 3 major regions: Japan, the US, and Europe, which at the time still included the UK, thanks Brexit. And because I'm originally from the UK before moving stateside, I knew about the market over there and soon realized the pricing was considerably cheaper than some games here in the US, so it seemed pretty straightforward. The language also being English meant I didn't have to worry compared to importing from Japan, so I had my goal: buy a Saturn, make it multi-region, and ship over some games. I went with the pseudo Saturn cart for playing games from any region. I'd say it's the least intrusive way to update your console and the most flexible option, so it's a good place to start. It also allows you to play original media versus some of the other choices. But if you're interested in other ways to mod your hardware, stick around till the end and I'll cover a few more ways to make it work. So I picked up my games in the mail and decided to start with a favourite of mine, Wipeout, a futuristic racer first released in 1995. It soon became obvious that something was wrong here. Either I'd gotten a lot older and my reaction times were abysmal, or this game was running way too fast. I thought it might have just been my memory, so let's try Destruction Derby, a sim racer with collision physics and real car damage. Wait, this menu isn't even displaying correctly, and I'm not sure I can select a menu option? What's going on? Alright, let's try another one. Fighting Vipers. Okay, so we can see through the fighters? So much for this being an easy option. So what's going on here? Have I just bought a bunch of games that are a waste of money? Well, first I have to give you a little background on the 3 regions the Sega Saturn released in, and we have to go back to a time before HDMI was a thing. As we know, the Saturn was released in Japan, the US, and Europe in the 1990s. Prior to HDMI being a universal picture format, these regions had their own separate TV specs, with Europe using the PAL format and the US and Japan using NTSC. Crucially, the PAL format had a frame rate of 50 per second, whereas NTSC used 60 frames per second. Now, it's not really a frame difference per se, and there are some more technical details behind these TV formats, but the speed difference is key here. This also means that games released in Europe actually ran at a different speed than the other 2 regions, and that is also a key discovery. During the 90s, there were jokes about how US gamers were better than those in Europe because the European games ran slower and so they were easier. And there's actually some grain of truth to that, except for games that were optimized for the PAL region. Some games companies actually released a different version of a game in Europe, which was made to run at a slower speed, so it would appear to play the same as any region. These are known as PAL optimized games, and what's weird is that not all games were optimized. This means if you buy a PAL game that wasn't optimized, like Resident Evil, on a US or Japan Saturn it will work as well as a local copy. If you were playing it in the UK though, it was running about 18% slower, and so there's some truth there. And what happens when you buy a PAL optimized game? Well, it's expecting to run at 50 frames per second, but now it's trying to run on your console at 60 frames per second, or about 18% faster. That's why Wipeout here is running so fast. If you watch the clock at the bottom, it's definitely running quicker than normal, and your ship is almost too fast to handle. Well, that and I still suck at this game, it's so good though. The speed and format differences also cause other issues like screen cutoff, visual artifacts like the textures missing in Fighting Vipers, and more. It's safe to say that PAL optimized games are only good for the European region, so it's best to leave them there. So is it a pure gamble if you find cheap PAL games and you want to get it shipped? Not at all. This European complete list from Randomized Gaming on Tumblr has each PAL released game and info on if it was fully optimized, has minor optimizations, or was unchanged from the US and Japan releases. I highly recommend leveraging this page if you're thinking about importing PAL games. I'm definitely going to be using it from now on. To settle any final questions you might have about importing, let's do a quick rundown of the different options from each region. If you're in the US, you can freely import Japan and PAL games that were not optimized to play on your console. Some PAL optimized games were released in Japan in English, making importing a little easier too. Similarly, if you're in Japan, you can import US and PAL games that were not optimized. If you're in Europe or the UK though, you have it the worst, unfortunately. Imported games will run slower than intended, and you even have that problem for the PAL games that were released that were unoptimized. It's going to be tough for you, I'm afraid, though there may be some hope soon. The Mister is an open source project with the goal of emulating older computers, consoles, and more using hardware emulation. It more closely recreates the experience of the original hardware, so games run just like the original. That project has been working on a Saturn core for a number of years, and it's currently in testing. Once it's generally available, it will give Mister owners a faithful recreation of the US Saturn anywhere in the world. One drawback is that physical media is not supported though, so you kinda know what that means for finding and running games on there. The project may end up being the single solution for any gamer who wants to get their hands on these classics, and I'm looking forward to the full release. It'll be a few years before every game is supported, but this is a passionate community, and I have every confidence they'll succeed. Now, for those of you looking for physical media and want a few options to support other region games, here's some info. I mentioned that I chose the Pseudo Saturn. It's a cartridge that you place into the slot on the console, and when you turn it on, it boots into its own screen. From here, you can insert the game you want to play, and the cart will take care of making sure the Saturn can play it. Does that mean that it works with any type of game disc? Pretty much, yeah. Your other plug-and-play solution is the Satiator. It's another cartridge-type solution that plugs into the video CD port that was included on the back of the console. You will need to include games on a microSD card to play them, so make sure you can back up your physical purchases, but once they're on the SD card, you're good to go. You can also still use your CD drive for local region games too. Beyond that, you will need to open and modify your console for these two remaining options, the Terra Onion Mode and the Fenrir ODE. Both are optical drive emulators, and they replace the CD drive on your Saturn, allowing you to provide your games on a microSD card versus putting in a disc. The Terra Onion option is a little bit more expensive, but it also supports SSD drives in case you need the extra speed or storage capacity. So there you have it. My plan to import some cheaper Saturn games taught me a lesson, and now I'm the wiser for it. Hopefully you can avoid my eagerness to play something imported and still keep that wallet happy. If you're looking for info on retro gaming mods, hardware options, and more, consider sticking around and subscribing. I'll be sharing some more of my experience back into retro gaming over the coming months, as well as insights from games of the past and where you can play them. Now get out there and import something you love safely. As well as insights from games of the past and where you can play them. Now get out there and fuck up the last line of this video. Yes, yeah.